The small, empty cradle was the last thing. Fenley had packed away the tiny shirts, folded the worn receiving blankets, and stored the single pair of knitted booties that had never touched her son's feet. Now, only the cradle remained. It was a simple box of pine her husband, Wei, had built with his own hands, sanding the edges smooth so they would not catch on delicate skin. But the silence it left in her small room above the laundry was heavier than any stone, a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Grief was a room with no air. She had to get out. The scent of lye soap and steam from downstairs, usually a comfort, felt suffocating. Fen descended the narrow, creaking stairs and stepped out into the brutal glare of a Nevada afternoon. It was July in Harmony Creek, 1878, and the heat rose in shimmering waves from the dusty main street. The town was a raw collection of clapboard buildings clinging to the newly laid railroad tracks, a place of transit and sweat and shallow-buried hopes. The air, thick with the smell of horse manure and hot metal, was a cacophony of noise, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a freight wagon's wheels, the high-pitched laughter of women gathered outside the general store. The noise was a welcome assault after the crushing quiet of her room. Fen kept her eyes down, her black tunic and trousers a stark contrast to the calico and gingham dresses of the other women. She was a familiar but unseen fixture in the town, the Chinese widow from the laundry, a ghost who moved through their world but was not part of it. They knew her husband had been one of the hundreds who died laying the track that was the town's very lifeblood. They knew, through the town's cruel and efficient gossip, that her own baby had followed him just 3 days ago, a life that had lasted less than a month. They knew, but they did not see her. Therefore, she was startled when a man's voice, raw with panic, cut through the din directly in front of her. "Please, somebody." She looked up. It was Jonas Holt. A homesteader. She'd seen him in town for supplies, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and sun-bleached hair that fell across his forehead. He always seemed self-contained, quiet. But now, his face was a mask of sheer desperation, his blue eyes wild. He was holding a bundle of white cloth against his chest, and from it came a sound that pierced Fen's carefully constructed wall of numbness, the thin, frantic wail of a hungry newborn. He was stumbling from one group to another. The women by the general store, Mrs. Albright and her friends, pulled back, their expressions a mixture of pity and distaste. "Goat's milk, Mr. Holt," one of them suggested, fanning her face. "Or a bit of sugar water on a rag." "He won't take it." "He just cries," Jonas pleaded, his voice cracking. The baby's cry hitched, a desperate, airless sound that twisted something deep inside Fen. Jonas turned, his eyes scanning the street, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see her standing there. His gaze locked on hers. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. The whole street seemed to fall quiet, the hammer blows ceasing, the wagon slowing. Everyone was watching. He stopped a few feet from her, his chest heaving. He looked from her face to the crying bundle and back again. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working. "Mrs. Lee," he began, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. He knew her name. The thought was a small shock. "My wife. Mary, she died." Giving birth, he gestured helplessly with his chin toward the baby. "He's 4 days old. He won't eat. I heard, they said you." He couldn't finish. The shame and desperation warred on his face. Fen knew what he was asking. She knew what the town knew about her. Her own body was a fresh wound, a vessel of grief still aching with the memory of a life it had failed to sustain. The milk she had made for her own son, was a painful, useless weight in her breasts. Jonas took another step, his eyes begging. He was a man broken by circumstance, stripped of all pride. "Can you nurse him?" he asked, the words so quiet they were nearly lost in the breeze. "Just for once? Please? I think he's starving." The request hung in the hot, still air. It was an impossible question, a violation of every unspoken rule that governed their separate worlds. To the white women watching, it was an indecent proposal. To the few Chinese men who watched from the shadows of the laundry, it was a dangerous entanglement. For Fen, it was a choice between the solitary safety of her grief and a pain so sharp it felt like life. The baby's cry was the only sound in the world. Her own son was silent forever. But this one was not. Without a word, Fen stepped forward. The crowd gasped as a collective body. She held out her arms. Jonas, his expression shifting from desperation to dazed disbelief, carefully passed the warm, squirming bundle to her. The moment the baby's weight settled in her arms, a jolt went through her, a current of feeling in a place she thought had died. He was so light, so fragile. His tiny, red face was screwed up in a mask of misery, his mouth opening and closing like a baby bird's. She turned her back on the gawking faces and sat on the wooden bench outside the land surveyor's office. She did not look at Jonas. She did not look at anyone. She looked only at the child. With practiced, gentle movements, she loosened the top buttons of her tunic. She shifted the baby, cradling his head in the crook of her arm, and guided him. He latched on immediately, his frantic cries ceasing with a sudden, shuddering gulp. A profound, bone-deep quiet fell over him, and over Fen. The painful pressure in her chest began to ease, replaced by the familiar, rhythmic pull of a nursing child. It was an agony and a relief so intertwined she could not tell them apart. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, it was in her arms. A single tear escaped and tracked a path through the dust on her cheek. A sharp voice broke the spell. "Mr. Holt! What is the meaning of this spectacle?" Fen opened her eyes. Mrs. Albright, the freight master's wife and the self-appointed guardian of Harmony Creek's morals, stood before them. Her face was flushed with outrage, her gloved hands clutching a parasol like a weapon. "This is utterly indecent. In the middle of the street!" And with her the final word was layered with a contempt that made the air feel colder. Jonas, who had been standing beside the bench like a stunned sentinel, moved to stand between Mrs. Albright and Fen. He was taller than the woman, his frame casting a long shadow. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his tone was more powerful than any shout. "Mrs. Albright," he said, his voice low and steady. "My son was starving. This woman," he gestured back toward Fen and the peacefully nursing infant, "is saving his life. If that's indecent to you, then I reckon your brand of decency is worthless." A murmur went through the small crowd. No one spoke to Eleanor Albright that way. Her husband, Franklin, controlled the freight that was the town's lifeline. To cross her was to cross him. But Jonas Holt didn't flinch. He just stood there, a simple farmer in dusty clothes, shielding a Chinese widow and his infant son from the town's most powerful woman. He had revealed a spine of solid iron. Mrs. Albright's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her face hardened into a mask of cold fury. With a final, venomous glare that encompassed Jonas, Fen, and the baby, she snapped her parasol shut, turned on her heel, and marched away, her friends scattering like quail before her. The tension on the street broke. The blacksmith's hammer started up again. People began to move, talking in low voices, dissecting the confrontation. The crisis had passed, but something had shifted. Jonas and Fen were no longer two separate, grieving people. They were a unit forged in public defiance. The baby, Samuel, as Jonas would later tell her his name was, finished nursing. He was asleep, his face peaceful, a tiny bead of milk on his lip. Fen felt a deep reluctance to let him go. Her arms felt right again. She carefully adjusted her clothing and wiped the baby's mouth with her thumb. Jonas knelt before her, his eyes filled with a gratitude so immense it was humbling. I don't have words," he stammered. "Thank you. I have to pay you." "Whatever you ask." He reached for the worn leather pouch at his belt. Fen looked from his earnest, tired face to the sleeping child. The ghost of her own son's face flickered in her mind. Pay was an insult to the memory of an. It was an insult to the life in her arms. She shook her head, a small, firm gesture. "No pay," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Jonas looked confused. "But I can't ask you to." She cut him off, her gaze direct. "You will bring him back tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. It was a command, born of a fierce, protective instinct she thought had been buried with her son. "Before he is crying." Jonah stared at her, a flicker of understanding dawning in his eyes. He was not just receiving charity, he was being given a responsibility. He nodded slowly. "Tomorrow," he promised. As he took the baby from her, his calloused fingers brushed against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a strange warmth through her. She watched him walk away, his shoulders a little less slumped, his step a little more certain. She did not yet know that this single act of kindness, this simple bargain, had made a powerful enemy for them both. And she did not know that the parcel waiting in the railroad's dusty freight office held the key to her entire future. The next day, Jonas appeared not on the street, but at the back door of the laundry. He held Samuel, wrapped tightly against the morning chill, his face scrubbed clean. He looked hesitant, unsure if his presence was a trespass. Fen led him up the narrow stairs to her room. The space was stark, containing only a narrow bed, a small table with one chair, and a wooden chest. The cradle was gone, tucked away in a corner beneath a canvas sheet. But the room was impeccably clean, the floorboard scrubbed white, and the air held the scent of ginger and almond soap, not the lie from downstairs. It was a pocket of stillness in a chaotic world. Jonas stood awkwardly in the center of the room, holding his son as if he were made of spun glass. "It's quiet up here," he said, his voice hushed. "It is," Fen replied, taking the baby from him. She sat in the single chair, and Jonas sank onto the edge of the wooden chest, watching as she settled Samuel and began to nurse him. The silence wasn't awkward. It was a shared space, filled by the soft sounds of the baby's feeding and the distant noises of the town below. "His name is Samuel," Jonas said quietly, breaking the silence. "After my father. My wife. Mary, she chose it." He spoke the name with a reverence that was also a fresh pain. She was from back east. Came out on the train. We had the homestead claim for a year. Just got the house built before the winter." His eyes had a faraway look, seeing a life that was no longer there. She never even got to see him proper. Fen listened, her gaze on Samuel's downy head. When he fell silent, she spoke, her own voice just as soft. "My husband was Wei. He built the cradle." She gestured toward the shrouded corner. "My son was an. It means peace." She said the words without tears, her stillness a testament to a grief so profound it was beyond expression. "It is good for my arms to have weight in them again." Jonas looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he understood. This was not a service he was buying. It was not charity she was giving. It was a mutual balm, a strange and unexpected partnership of sorrow. He was giving her a life to hold on to, and she was giving his son life itself. His gaze fell upon a small, worn book on her table. It was a Chinese-English dictionary, its cover soft and frayed at the edges, the pages filled with tiny, neat characters next to their English counterparts. "You learned yourself?" he asked, his voice filled with a new respect. She nodded. "Wei taught me some. The rest, I learned from the newspapers they used to wrap the fish." He reached out and gently touched the cover of the book. It was a small thing, but it spoke of a vast, hidden world of determination and intelligence that no one else in Harmony Creek had ever bothered to look for. He saw not just a grieving widow, but a woman of immense strength. Their arrangement settled into a quiet routine. Twice a day, Jonas would bring Samuel to her room. Sometimes they talked, sharing small pieces of their pasts. He told her about the challenges of his homestead, the well that was threatening to run dry, the fence that needed mending. She told him about her village in Guangdong, the long boat journey, the hope she and Wei had shared for a life in America. Other times, they sat in comfortable silence, two lonely souls finding a strange solace in each other's company while a tiny baby bridged the chasm between them. But Harmony Creek had a long memory. Franklin Albright, the freight master, had not forgotten the public humiliation of his wife. He was a man who understood power not as a tool, but as a weapon. He noticed Jonas Holt's wagon outside the Chinese laundry every day. And he began to act. First, a shipment of fencing wire Jonas had ordered and paid for went missing from the freight depot. Albright claimed it was never on the manifest. Then, a crate of seeds for his winter wheat was accidentally sent to a different territory. When Jonas went to the general store to ask for credit to buy more, the owner, a man who relied on Albright's goodwill, regretfully turned him down. Albright was executing a slow, quiet strangulation. He was cutting Jonas off, trying to starve him out of his claim and out of the town. He was making an example of him, a public lesson on the consequences of defying the established order. One evening, Jonas arrived looking more defeated than Fenn had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped, and the lines around his eyes were etched deeper. He handed Samuel to her and sank onto the chest, running a hand through his hair. "He's got me, Fenn," he said, his voice flat. "Albright. He's squeezing me out. I can't get supplies. Can't get credit. The homestead will fail if I can't get my winter crop in." He looked at her, his face a portrait of misery. The unspoken solution hung between them. If he stopped coming, if he publicly distanced himself from her, Albright might relent. He could save his land, his future. All he had to do was abandon her. Instead, he said, "I sold my second-best horse this afternoon. The bay. It's enough cash to get supplies from the depot in Carson City. It'll take me 3 days to get there and back, but I can bypass Albright." The words hit Fenn with the force of a physical blow. He had sold a vital part of his livelihood, not to save himself by leaving her, but to save himself so he could stay. He had chosen her, and his son's connection to her, over the easier path. He had chosen them. In that moment, something shifted in her heart. This was more than gratitude. It was a fierce, protective loyalty to this decent, stubborn man. She would not let him fight alone. The next morning, while Jonas was gone, Fenn did something she had never done before. She sought out Mr. Chen, the elderly, respected man who owned the laundry and acted as the unofficial leader of Harmony Creek's small Chinese community. She told him about Jonas Holt, about his kindness, his defiance of Mrs. Albright, and the trouble he was now in. The elders listened patiently. They had endured the contempt of the town for years, surviving through solidarity and mutual support. In Jonas, they saw not just a white man, but a man who had treated one of their own with honor when it was costly to do so. That evening, a small delegation of Chinese men, led by Mr. Chen, arrived at Jonas's homestead. They brought sacks of rice and dried vegetables. They brought their tools. Using water-finding techniques passed down through generations, they found a better place to dig a new well. They worked with a quiet, tireless efficiency, turning Jonas's solitary struggle into a communal effort. They were repaying a debt of honor. When Jonas returned, exhausted, with his wagon full of supplies, he found a new, deeper well providing clear, steady water, and a community that had claimed him as one of their own. A few days later, as Jonas was leaving Fenn's room after the evening feeding, he paused. He was looking at a notice nailed to the wall outside the general store, freshly posted. Public auction, it read. Unclaimed freight. The railroad was clearing out old parcels. Jonas's eyes narrowed. He was certain some of his lost goods were in that lot, though he could never prove it. But as he read further, another item on the list caught his eye. It was a small crate, addressed to Mr. Wei Li, held for over a year. "Fenn," he called, his voice urgent. "Come look at this." She came downstairs, and he pointed to the notice. Her eyes found her husband's name. A parcel for Wei? After all this time? A flicker of the old, sharp grief returned, but it was mixed with a new curiosity. What could he have ordered that never arrived? What piece of their shared past was waiting in that dusty storeroom? The auction was held 2 days later in the freight depot, a vast, cavernous building that smelled of sawdust and machine oil. Franklin Albright presided over it, a smug smile on his face as he sold off the lost hopes and forgotten plans of others. Jonas and Fenn stood at the back of the small crowd. Fen felt the familiar stares, but this time, they felt different. Jonas stood beside her, solid and unmovable. She was not alone. They waited as Albright sold off barrels of nails, bolts of cloth, and crates of tools. Jonas watched intently, his jaw tight, but none of the items were definitively his. Finally, Albright called out, "Last item." A small crate, addressed to Wei Li, unclaimed for 13 months. "We'll start the bidding at $1. "That parcel is not for auction," Jonas said, his voice ringing through the depot. Albright's smile faltered. He glared at Jonas. "This is railroad property, Holt. Everything here is for auction." "Not if the legal heir is here to claim it," Jonas countered, stepping forward. He gestured to Fen. "This is Mrs. Fen Li, Wei Li's widow. She is here to claim her husband's property. According to territorial law, a widow had rights to her deceased husband's estate." Albright knew this. His face darkened with fury. He had likely counted on the Chinese woman being too ignorant or too intimidated to make a claim. He had underestimated both her and the man standing beside her. "Proof of identity." Albright snapped. Mr. Chen, the laundry owner, stepped forward from the crowd. "I have known Mr. and Mrs. Li since they arrived in this town. I can attest this is she and a few other townsfolk, men who had been impressed by Jonas's stand and disgusted by Albright's tactics, murmured their agreement. Defeated, Albright slammed his gavel down. "Fine. Take it. It's worthless junk anyway." Jonas carried the small, dust-covered crate out into the sunlight. With a crowbar borrowed from the blacksmith, he pried open the lid. Inside, nestled in yellowed straw, were not tools or personal effects. It was a stack of papers, held together with twine. At the top was a letter, in Wei's careful hand. But beneath it was an official document. A deed. It was a deed for a quarter-acre plot of land, right on the edge of town, purchased from the railroad company itself. Wei, working extra hours, had been saving and planning. He was going to build her a house, a home of their own, away from the steam and servitude of the laundry. The final page was a letter from the railroad confirming the purchase, a letter Albright, as freight master, would have seen. He had hidden the parcel, hoping to acquire the valuable land himself for a new warehouse once it was declared abandoned. Jonas's public stand for Fen had not only earned him an enemy, it had accidentally led them to the very evidence of that enemy's corruption. 3 months later, the bite of autumn was in the air. On the quarter-acre plot that was now legally Fen's, a small, sturdy house stood, smelling of fresh-cut pine. Jonas, with the help of Mr. Chen and his friends, had built it for her. It wasn't large, but it was hers, a testament to a love she had lost and a friendship she had found. The power of the Albrights in Harmony Creek was broken. When word of the hidden deed spread, coupled with the stories of Jonas's missing supplies, people saw Franklin Albright not as a powerful man, but as a petty thief. His influence shriveled. Jonas's homestead was thriving. The new well provided ample water, his winter wheat was sprouting in neat rows, and his small herd of cattle was healthy. Most importantly, Samuel was a chubby, happy baby, who now broke into a wide, gummy smile whenever Fen entered the room. One cool evening, Jonas sat on the porch of Fen's new house, rocking a sleeping Samuel in his arms. The door opened, and Fen came out. She handed him a steaming cup of tea, her fingers brushing against his as he took it. He didn't let go. His large, calloused hand gently covered hers where it rested on the warm cup. He looked at her, her face softened by the twilight, then at the solid house behind her, and finally at the sleeping son in his arms. The empty cradle that had haunted the start of their story had been replaced by a home, a future, and a quiet, unshakable bond. Love, he was learning, was not always a lightning strike. Sometimes, it was a steady, resilient thing built one decent act at a time. It was the simple, profound choice to stand with someone when it was easier to walk away. And in the quiet of that Nevada evening, holding the hands of the woman who had saved his son and the son who had saved them both, Jonas Holt felt peaceful for the first time in a very long time. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.